This is how to read a regulation put on by M. Vale and Associates. The problem that I always have is that regulations were written by lawyers, and it's difficult to understand what the regulation's really trying to tell me, anyhow. So hopefully this segment will help you on understanding regulations. We're going to talk about what FARs are, Federal Aviation Regulations. We're going to talk about how regulations are formatted. We're also going to find out how to determine if a regulation applies to our situation. For instance, I'm not a flight attendant, and there's regulations for flight attendants. So where do you look in the regulation to find out whether or not this applies? We'll also talk about how to decipher the lawyer words. We're going to talk about what a Federal Aviation Regulation is, or FAR. We're going to talk about glossary or terms. We're going to talk about the layout, table of contents, Chapter 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. We'll talk about keywords, applicability, order of regulations, and then we'll talk about some sample regulations. The Federal Aviation Regulations are part of a federal system called the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, this grouping of government regulations includes the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Defense. The FAA is one group of this, and it's in Section 14, also known as 14 CFR for Code of Federal Regulations. So FAA, Air and Space is all in 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. These regulations are administered by the Federal Aviation Administration, and the FAA, they're kind of like the cops of the sky. They are headquartered at 800 Independence Avenue in Washington, D.C. Their offices are across the street from the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and they're the ones who have jurisdiction over the federal aviation system. The FAA governs everything from airports to rescue, air traffic control, maintenance, flight crew members, and the like. FAR, or Federal Aviation Regulation, is what we will call a rule or a law. So the term has a couple of different synonyms: a rule, a regulation, or a law. That's a Federal Aviation Regulation, or FAR. So what is the meaning of sub? Well, a submarine is something that goes under the water or under the surface of the water. A subway is under the street. So if we see the word subpart, it's underneath a part. It's the next grouping underneath a part. Chapter, subchapter, we'll see this term. Subchapter goes under a chapter. So if we look at the FARs like we look at a book, and so the example I'm going to use is a cookbook. If we look at the grouping of FARs, there's a lot of regulations. They're grouped like a book. So they're arranged by section. So if I have a French cookbook, for instance, I might have a meat section and a pastry section. The meat section would contain recipes for meat dishes, and the pastry section might contain recipes for pastries. So here is the regulations, the aviation regulations, and if you see, we have groupings, we have chapters on them. We have a chapter that the chapter is actually all of the regulations, and then we have subchapters. The subchapter is the next logical grouping right below the chapter. And so here we have Subchapter A, definition, Subchapter B, procedural rules. The purpose of this slide, or what we're looking at on this slide, is that the regulations are logically grouped into sections. Okay, so there you have chapters is the next grouping, and you have subchapters, and you also have then parts and subparts. So we'll see this over and over again. Back to the meaning of sub. It's the logical group that's underneath its section. So subpart and part, and chapter, subchapter. Okay, here we see subchapters, and these logical groupings are the subchapters. So subchapter A is definition. Let's jump down to where it says subchapter B, procedural rules. You'll see there's a whole bunch of parts below the subchapter. So I might have something that's like a section of meat dishes, and we'll see this in the next slide, and we'll have several different types of meat dishes, right? Well, here we have a subchapter, procedural rules, and we have several different groupings of procedural rules, and those are called parts. Okay, back to our breakdown. We show here subchapter D is airmen, and then we have different types of airmen. We have pilots, we have flight crew members like flight attendants who might fly, but they're not a pilot. So here we have, for instance, airmen. We have flight instructors and pilots, and we have mechanics here, and we have medical standards. So subchapter, we started with chapter, and then we moved to subchapter, and the subchapter is airmen. The chapter was the grouping of all aviation regulations. The next logical grouping was subchapter, which was airmen, and then we jumped down to part, and the part is grouping the different types of airmen in this example. Back to our French cookbook. So where we might have FARs are the whole regulations. We had French dishes, where all the dishes in our book. Next grouping was subchapter, and we used the example airmen. And in the French cookbook, if you started out with French dishes, you had meat dishes, and you had several different types of meat dishes or poultry dishes. The next logical grouping being part for FARs. So when we grouped up the meat dishes, we said you got fish, you got poultry, you got all these different types. So all we're doing is we're making logical groupings starting at the top with chapter, subchapter, part, and subpart. Okay, numbering system. The FAA does a kind of a weird thing with their numbering system. Here we've got an example where we're looking at Part 21. Now, in that part, these are all individual regulations. 21.1 is a regulation. Now, when the FAA numbers things, they number from the decimal point out. What I mean is we're in Part 21. So all these regulations are Part 21 regulations. And then you have 21.1, .3, 5. The counting system that the FAA uses is after they signify the part. So we got 21 dot. On the right side of the decimal point, we're going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 99, 100. The numbers are in sequence to the right of the decimal place. It's not like the Dewey Decimal System. It's not like math, where 21.1 and 21.10 are the same number. 21.100 in math, it's the same number. In this case, we count up. So we start with 1, we count up to 9, then we go to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way up to 99. So remember that the way the FARs are numbered, they're numbered like you would count. So we talked about sub being underneath something. So subpart. Subpart is the next smaller grouping. We start with parts, and then underneath that, so here's Part 63, and then underneath Part 63 is the subpart. And it breaks it up into Subpart A, Subpart B, Subpart C. So you can see this is just flowing down like a tree, or like a family tree, or like any other logical breakdown of an outline. Subchapters show the subject of the category, and then parts are grouped next. Right after that we have appendices, and the appendix is at the end of the chapter, and what they use appendixes for is if you have a long list of items and you don't want to put it in the regulation to make it, the regulation ends up being really wordy, we can put a list in the appendix. Okay, here we have an example. This is the appendix to Part 43, and you don't have to read all this, but it's just showing you that here's a list, and the list is things that maintenance items that a pilot can do, or maintenance items. So they've got this big long list, changing a tire, changing the oil, things that a pilot can do, and they didn't want to put that in the regulation, so they created an appendix. Okay, here we zoomed in a little bit on these appendices to Part 43. You can see there's about 5 appendices. One is empty. It says reserved, Appendix C, but these are all appendixes or appendices that are in Part 43. 43 happens to be the section on maintenance regulations. The FAA's trick question is what I call this. This is a Special Federal Aviation Regulation, or SFAR. An SFAR is a temporary regulation. It's one that the FAA comes out with that's going to be for a limited amount of time. The FAA can renew these, and it's usually used for special circumstances. So in this Special Federal Aviation Regulation example, you'll see that they've listed the SFARs at the beginning of the section of the regulation section, part, if you will. So for instance, I look at Part 63. This section is certification of flight crew members other than pilots. This is for people like dispatchers and non-pilot types. In Part 63, there are two SFARs we're showing here. So they show the SFARs first, and below that is Subpart A. So the FAA will group these in the regulations at the very beginning because it's kind of like a revision. It's a Special Federal Aviation Regulation. Okay, here I'm showing an SFAR. You can read this. You might be able to zoom in on it. It's not real important. I'll explain what it is. In this example, the Federal Aviation Regulation had a time limit that if you did your flight training, you had something like 2 years from finishing your flight training to taking your written and flying test. Well, some people got called up with the reserves and got sent overseas to fight a war. So the FAA wrote an SFAR, a temporary regulation, that allowed people who got deployed in a military operation to actually have a longer period of time to get their training in. So if you had you'd gotten your flight training in and you're ready to take your test, and all of a sudden you get shipped overseas, the FAA says, okay, well, if your time runs out, we'll give you some extra time. They had to pass a regulation to do that. So this is an example of a Special Federal Aviation regulation. It was time limited, and it was written for a specific situation. Okay, let's talk about applicability for just a second. Applicability, the word applicability lends itself to who does this apply to? What situation is this regulation written for? So regulations will have an applicability. I mean, there's a reason that they wrote the regulation, and there's somebody they wrote this regulation for. Applicability tells us the who, it tells us the what if. And when they write a section of the regulations, oftentimes the very first thing that they put in it is applicability, and that tells us what it was written for and what situation does it apply to. So here's an example of applicability in 67.1. This section has medical standards, and the FAA has written regulations that people will meet certain medical requirements. What this applicability lends itself to is pilots. So for example, I'm an aircraft mechanic. The question is, somebody comes to me and they say, okay, here's this regulation. It says you have to have a physical. You have to have a FAA flight physical. Well, guess what? As a mechanic, I do not. And the place where I know that I don't is if I read 67.1 applicability. And if you read this, this says medical procedures for airmen in issuing medical certificates. And if I dig deeper, I find out that a mechanic doesn't have to have a medical certificate, but a pilot does. So this example of applicability tells me who this section of regulations was written for. In this case, it wasn't written for me. So if we look further into the regulations, we'll see that the applicability, this is where it drills down, and the very first section of this part, Part 67, Medical Standards, is applicability. And once we've determined that it is applicable, we can drill down deeper and we can find out, for example, for pilots, all the things that have to be tested. And here's a list of all the things that are on a pilot's medical. The word shall, as it's used in vocabulary, means you must do it. It's in the imperative sense, and this is in FAR Part 1, which is the section that has definitions. But all you have to do is remember that if you see in a regulation the word shall, it is not optional. You must comply. The word may, if you find it in a regulation, means it's optional. You can do something if you want to. It's allowed, but you do not have to. Very important word, the word may.